What if a hawk, born to rip the sky apart with talons of death, turned her wings into a shield for 3 orphaned bobcat cubs trembling in a fire-scorched barn? In the wild heart of Montana, Clara Bennett stumbled upon a mystery that shattered every rule of nature, a sight so raw it'll stop your breath and thaw your tears. Was this fierce predator their savior? Or had she stolen them from fate's cruel claws? Hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers to uncover more wild, heart-wrenching tales like this. The autumn morning hung heavy over the Montana grasslands, the air still thick with the faint tang of smoke from a wildfire that had torn through the hills just weeks before. Clara Bennett stood on the creaking porch of her old farmhouse, her gray hair pulled back in a loose braid, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. At 62, she'd grown used to the silence of this place. 10 years alone since the car crash took her husband Jack and their daughter Lily, leaving her with nothing but this weathered ranch and the ghosts of better days. The wind carried a chill that bit at her knuckles, but it wasn't the cold that made her pause. It was a sound. High and sharp, not the usual hoot of an owl or the skitter of mice she'd come to know. It came from the barn, a sagging relic of peeling red paint that loomed across the yard like a tired sentinel. Clara set the mug down, her brow furrowing. She grabbed the worn hickory walking stick by the door, not for support, but for whatever might be lurking out there. The grass crunched under her boots as she crossed the yard, each step stirring up the dust of a life she'd stopped living. The barn door groaned as she pushed it open, and the smell of old hay and damp wood hit her like a memory. That sound came again, louder now, a keening cry that didn't belong. She tightened her grip on the stick and climbed the splintered ladder to the loft, her knees protesting with every rung. When she reached the top, she froze. There, in a nest of straw and shadows, was Blaze. A Harris's hawk she'd seen circling the fields for years, its tan wings streaked with the colors of a sunset. But Blaze wasn't alone. Beneath the spread of those fierce wings were 3 bobcat cubs, tiny and trembling, their spotted fur matted with soot. Their eyes barely open, glinted in the dim light. Dusty, the biggest, with a scruffy tuft on his head. Clover, smaller and curled tight, and Flint, the runt, barely moving. Blaze's golden eyes locked onto Clara's, not with the wild hunger of a predator, but with something deeper, something protective. The hawk shifted, her talons curling inward as if to shield the cubs from the world beyond. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She'd watched Blaze snatch rabbits from the air, a blur of feathers and death. But this didn't make sense. Why would a hawk, built to kill, cradle creatures it should have torn apart? Her hand shook as she lowered the stick, her mind racing. The cubs mewled, pressing closer to Blaze, and Clara felt a pang she hadn't known in years. The ache of a mother seeing something small and helpless. She thought of Lily, her little girl with the gap-toothed smile, gone too soon. The barn seemed to close in around her, the walls whispering echoes of a life she couldn't reclaim. She stumbled back down the ladder, her boots thudding against the wood, and fumbled for the old rotary phone in the kitchen. Ethan Hayes picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly from too many nights patrolling the burned-out forests. "Clara, what's wrong?" he asked, sensing the tremor in her silence. She didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone? A hawk was playing mother to bobcats in your barn. "Just come," she said finally. "Bring your truck, and maybe a camera." As she hung up, Clara glanced out the window at the barn, its silhouette stark against the pale sky. Blaze's cry pierced the stillness again, softer this time, like a lullaby. Clara's chest tightened. She didn't know what this meant, whether it was a miracle or a fluke of nature gone wrong, but she knew one thing. She couldn't turn away. Not from those cubs, not from Blaze, not from the strange, fragile family taking root in the ashes of her world. She pulled on her coat and headed back outside, the walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the ground. Whatever came next, she'd face it with them. The rumble of Ethan Hayes's pickup truck broke the quiet of the afternoon, its tires kicking up dust as it rolled into Clara's yard. She stood by the barn door, arms crossed against the bite of the wind, watching as Ethan climbed out. Tall and wiry, his ranger hat tilted back to reveal a face etched with years of sun and sorrow. Behind him came a woman Clara didn't know, her dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, a notepad tucked under her arm. "This is Dr. Rachel Monroe," Ethan said, nodding toward her. "She's a bird expert from Bozeman. Figured we might need her brain for whatever's going on in there." Clara led them up to the loft without a word, her boots steady on the ladder despite the tremor in her hands. When they reached the top, Ethan let out a low whistle and Rachel's eyes widened behind her glasses. Blaze sat perched in the straw, her tan wings half spread, a fresh-killed vole dangling from her beak. She tore it into tiny strips, dropping them one by one into the open mouths of Dusty, Clover, and Flint. The cubs squirmed and mewled, their tiny paws batting at each other for the scraps. Blaze's golden gaze flicked up to the newcomers, sharp and unyielding, but she didn't move from her post. "Good Lord," Ethan muttered, scratching the back of his neck. "I've seen a lot in these hills, but this beats all." Rachel stepped closer, crouching low to study the scene. "She's a Harris's hawk," she said, her voice soft but steady. "They're social birds more than most raptors, but this, feeding bobcat cubs, that's not in any textbook I've read." She scribbled something in her notepad, then glanced at Clara. "How long has this been going on?" "Since this morning, far as I know," Clara replied, her voice rough around the edges. "Found him like this when I heard the noise. Figured the fire drove him here." Rachel nodded, her brow furrowing. "Could be. The blaze last month torched half the forest. Probably took her nest, maybe her own chicks, too. Sometimes trauma flips a switch in their instincts. She's protecting these cubs like they're hers." Clara watched as Blaze nudged Flint, the smallest cub, with her beak, urging him to eat. The tenderness in that gesture hit her like a punch. She hadn't seen anything so gentle since Lily used to tuck her dolls into bed. "So, what do we do?" she asked, turning to Ethan. He shrugged, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "They're wild, Clara. We could take him to a rehab center, but that hawk's not gonna let him go easy." Rachel shook her head. "She's bonded. Breaking that now might do more harm than good." That night, Clara made a choice. She dragged an old water trough up to the loft and filled it with a jug from the house, then left a pile of raw chicken scraps she'd thawed from the freezer. Blaze eyed her warily, but didn't protest as Clara backed away. By morning, the scraps were gone, and Dusty had taken to following Clara around the barn, his oversized paws stumbling over the straw. Clover and Flint stayed close to Blaze, curling up under her wings like they belonged there. Clara caught herself smiling, a rusty, unfamiliar feeling, and realized she was part of this now, whether she'd meant to be or not. Ethan stopped by daily, bringing cans of tuna or whatever meat he could spare, his gruff voice softening when he talked to the cubs. Rachel came too, setting up a little recorder to capture Blaze's calls, muttering about a research paper she might never finish. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Clara sat on an old crate in the loft. Watching Blaze preen Dusty's fur with her beak, the cub purred, a sound so out of place it made her laugh, a dry, cracked sound that echoed in the stillness. Blaze looked up, and for a moment their eyes met, two mothers, scarred by loss, holding on to something new. The days blurred into a rhythm of care and quiet wonder. Clara started leaving the barn door cracked open, letting Blaze stretch her wings in the yard while the cubs tumbled after her. She didn't know how long this could last. Wild things weren't meant to stay, but for now it was enough. The smoke-scented air felt lighter somehow, and the ache in her chest loosened its grip, just a little. Out there in the ashes of her world, a strange family was growing, and Clara Bennett was its unexpected keeper. The night fell hard over the Montana grasslands, the kind of dark that swallowed the stars and left only the wind to whisper through the emptiness. Clara lay awake in her narrow bed, the quilt pulled tight around her shoulders, listening to the distant howl of coyotes, or so she thought. But then the sound shifted, deeper and more guttural, a chorus of growls that sent a shiver down her spine. She sat up, her heart thudding against her ribs. It wasn't coyotes. It was wolves, gaunt and desperate after the wildfires stripped their hunting grounds bare, and they were close. She grabbed the old Winchester rifle from the closet, the one Jack had kept for emergencies, and pulled on her boots. The barn was quiet when she stepped outside, the air sharp with frost, but then Blaze's cry cut through the stillness, a piercing shriek that made Clara's blood run cold. She ran, the rifle heavy in her hands, her breath fogging in the night. The barn door was ajar just as she'd left it, and she heard the low rumble of snarls from within. She climbed the ladder 2 rungs at a time, her knees screaming, and burst into the loft. Blaze was a blur of feathers and fury, her tan wings beating the air as she dove at a wolf, lean and gray, its eyes glinting with hunger. 3 more circled below, their teeth bared, drawn by the scent of dusty clover and flint. The cubs huddled in the straw, their tiny bodies pressed together, hissing and swiping with clumsy paws. Blaze struck again, her talons raking the lead wolf's flank, but it snapped back. Catching her wing in its jaws, she screeched, a sound that tore at Clara's chest and tumbled to the floor. "Get out!" Clara shouted, raising the rifle. She fired a shot into the air, the crack echoing off the barn walls. The wolves flinched, their ears flattening, but they didn't retreat. Not yet. Blaze struggled to her feet, her left wing dragging, blood matting her feathers. She staggered between the cubs and the pack, her golden eyes blazing, refusing to back down. Dusty growled, baring his milk teeth, while Clover and Flint pressed against her, trembling but defiant. Footsteps pounded behind Clara. Ethan, bleary-eyed and breathless, his ranger coat thrown over pajamas. He'd been sleeping in his truck out back, a habit he'd picked up since the cubs arrived. "Wolves," he panted, drawing a pistol from his belt. "Damn fire's got him starving!" He aimed at the lead wolf, but Clara grabbed his arm. "Wait," she hissed. "Blaze! She's still in there." The hawk lunged again, weaker now, her talons slashing at the nearest wolf's snout. It yelped and reared back, giving Clara a clear shot. She fired another warning round, this one grazing the straw near the pack's feet. Ethan followed with a shout, his voice rough and commanding. The wolves hesitated, their growls faltering, then turned and bolted out the barn door, vanishing into the night like shadows chased by thunder. Clara dropped the rifle and stumbled to Blaze, falling to her knees in the straw. The hawk lay still, her chest heaving, that broken wing splayed out like a fallen flag. Dusty nudged her with his nose, mewling softly, while Clover and Flint curled close, their tiny bodies warm against her side. Clara's hands hovered over Blaze, afraid to touch, afraid to break whatever fragile thread was holding her together. "You stupid, brave bird," she whispered, her voice cracking. Tears blurred her vision, hot and unfamiliar after so many dry years. Ethan knelt beside her, his face grim. "She took the hit for him," he said, holstering his pistol. "Never seen anything like it." He reached for his radio, calling for Rachel, but Clara barely heard him. She scooped Blaze up, cradling her against her chest, the hawk's weight so light it felt like holding air. Blood stained her coat, but she didn't care. She carried Blaze down the ladder, the cubs trailing behind, their little claws clicking on the wood. In the kitchen, Clara laid Blaze on the table, wrapping her in an old towel. The cubs climbed onto chairs, watching with wide, worried eyes. Ethan stood by the door, his hat in his hands, the silence heavy between them. "She's a fighter," he said finally, but his tone carried no promises. Clara nodded, her fingers brushing Blaze's feathers. She'd lost so much. Jack, Lily, the life she'd known. But this hawk had given everything to save 3 little lives that weren't even hers. And now, Clara thought, it was her turn to fight for Blaze. The dawn broke soft and gray over the Montana plains, painting the farmhouse in muted light. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee, staring at Blaze. The hawk rested in a makeshift nest of towels and an old sweater, her broken wing bandaged tight against her body. Dr. Rachel Monroe had arrived at first light, her face still creased from sleep, and worked quickly, cleaning the wound, stitching where she could, and muttering about infection risks. "She's tough," Rachel said, packing up her kit. "But flying? That's done. She'll never lift off again." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to answer. Dusty, Clover, and Flint sprawled across the floor, their spotted coats dusted with flour from a bag they'd knocked over in the night. They'd refused to leave Blaze, even when Ethan tried to herd them back to the barn. Now they slept in a tangle of paws and tails, their soft snores filling the room. Clara watched them, her chest aching with something she couldn't name. They were growing fast. Dusty's ears had started to perk like a proper bobcat's. Clover's legs stretched longer each day, and even Flint, the runt, had a spark of wildness in his eyes. They weren't cubs anymore. Not really. Rachel stayed on, helping Clara turn the barn into a sanctuary. They hauled scrap wood from the shed and built a low fence around the loft, a barrier against whatever else the night might bring. Ethan brought wire mesh to cover the gaps, his hands steady despite the shadows under his eyes. "Wolves won't get in again," he promised, hammering the last nail. Clara didn't say it aloud, but she wondered if the real danger was already inside her, letting herself care too much, knowing it couldn't last. Weeks passed, and Blaze grew stronger, though her wings stayed limp. She'd hop to the edge of the loft, her golden eyes tracking the sky she'd never touch again, then turn back to the cubs. They followed her everywhere, tumbling over each other to keep up. Clara watched them from the yard, a bucket of scraps in her hands, chicken bones, bits of fish, whatever she could spare. Blaze taught them to hunt in her own way, dropping food for them to pounce on, her beak nudging their clumsy attempt. Dusty caught a mouse one morning, parading it proudly before laying it at her feet. Clover batted at grasshoppers, and Flint, bolder now, stalked shadows in the straw. But the wild called louder every day. Clara saw it in the way Dusty's ears twitched at the rustle of leaves beyond the fence, how Clover stared at the hills with a hunger Blaze couldn't sate. One night, Ethan sat with her on the porch, a thermos of coffee between them. "They're not pets, Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Sooner or later, they'll need to go." She bristled, her fingers tightening on the railing. "And Blaze? What happens to her when they're gone?" Ethan didn't answer, just tipped his hat back and looked at the stars. Rachel took a different tack, her scientist's mind buzzing with ideas. "We could keep them here," she said over breakfast, scribbling notes on a napkin. "Study them. This bond, it's rare. Could mean something big for conservation." Clara shook her head, the words sticking in her throat. She didn't want them caged, not for science or anything else. She'd lost Lily to a twist of fate, not a choice. She wouldn't trap these lives too. Late one evening, Clara climbed to the loft alone, the air thick with the scent of hay and frost. Blaze perched on a beam, the cubs asleep below her. Clara sat cross-legged in the straw, pulling an old photo from her pocket. Jack and Lily, smiling in the summer sun. "You'd have loved this mess," she murmured, her voice raising Bobcats. "Sounds like one of your stories." Blaze tilted her head, her eyes catching the moonlight, and Clara felt the weight of it all. The love, the loss, the letting go. She'd held onto her grief like a lifeline, but these wild things had loosened its grip. Maybe loving them meant setting them free, even if it broke her all over again. She stood, brushing straw from her jeans, and made a quiet vow. She'd give them time to grow, time to choose. But deep down she knew the day was coming when the barn would feel too small and the hills too close. For now, though, she'd stay their keeper, guarding this fragile family as long as they'd let her. A year slipped by like water through the cracks of Clara's old farmhouse, the seasons turning the Montana plains from gold to white and back again. The barn stood steady now, its patched walls a testament to the hands that had kept it whole. Clara's, Ethan's, even Rachel's when she wasn't buried in her notes. Blaze ruled the loft with a quiet grace, her broken wing a badge of battles won, her golden eyes still sharp as ever. Dusty, Clover, and Flint weren't cubs anymore. They'd grown into their wildness. Lean and sleek, their spotted coats catching the sun as they prowled the yard. But they never strayed far, not yet. Clara watched them from the porch each morning, her coffee steaming in the chill. Dusty had a hunter's stride now, his ears flicking at every sound, while Clover moved with a cat's silent grace, her eyes bright with curiosity. Flint, once the weakest, had found his strength, his compact frame darting after rabbits in the grass. Blaze couldn't chase them anymore, but she'd sit on the fence, her head cocked, watching her children learn the world she'd once ruled from the sky. Clara saw the pride in her, a mother's pride, and it stirred something deep. Memories of Lily running through the fields, her laughter trailing like a song. One crisp fall day, the trio came back from the hills with a gift. Clara heard their paws thudding across the yard and stepped out to see Dusty leading the way, a young deer slung across his shoulders. Clover and Flint flanked him, their tails high, and they dropped the kill at Blaze's feet. A small, perfect buck, its antlers just budding. Blaze hopped down from her perch, her talons clicking on the ground, and nudged the deer with her beak. She looked up at them, then at Clara, and let out a soft cry, not the fierce shriek of a hawk, but something gentler, a thank you carved in sound. Clara's throat tightened. They were saying goodbye, in their way. That night, Dusty didn't return to the loft. Clover lingered by the barn door, her eyes on the forest, and Flint paced the yard, restless. By morning, they were gone, all three, swallowed by the hills that had called them since they could walk. Clara stood in the empty loft, straw crunching under her boots. Blaze perched beside her. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't empty. It held the weight of everything they'd built together, a family born from ashes, held together by a hawk's stubborn love. Weeks later, Clara sat on the porch, a wool blanket draped over her shoulders, when she heard a rustle in the trees. Dusty emerged first, his fur dusted with pine needles, followed by Clover and Flint, their eyes gleaming in the dusk. They didn't stay, just circled the yard, sniffing the air, then dropped a rabbit at the barn door before vanishing again. Blaze hopped out to meet it, her wing dragging, and Clara laughed, a sound that broke the quiet like a stone through glass. They'd come home not to stay, but to show her they remembered. Ethan stopped by one evening, a grin tugging at his weathered face. "Got a call from town," he said, leaning against the railing. "Folks spotted bobcats up north, 3 of them, hunting together. Sound familiar?" Clara smiled, her fingers tracing the edge of an old photo in her pocket. Jack and Lily, frozen in time. "They're doing fine," she said, and meant it. Rachel had started a fund in Blaze's name. A small thing to help wildlife after wildfires, and Clara let her pin a sign to the barn, Blaze's Haven. It felt right. The next morning, Clara carried her rocking chair to the edge of the yard, settling it where she could see the hills. Blaze perched on the armrest, her feathers ruffling in the breeze. Clara pulled the photo out, holding it up so the light caught their faces. "You'd have loved her," she whispered, her voice steady now. "She's the toughest thing I ever met." Blaze tilted her head, her gaze meeting Clara's, and for a moment they were just 2 souls who'd lost everything and found something new. The world was full of endings, Clara knew that better than most, but sometimes love showed up where you least expected it, stitching together the broken pieces with threads of courage and grace. Blaze had taught her that, and Dusty, Clover, and Flint had carried it forward. As the sun dipped low, Clara rocked gently, the hawk at her side, knowing this wasn't goodbye, it was a promise that family, however it's made, endures beyond the wild.